Hello everyone, and welcome. Today, we are returning to the world of The Bridge of the Gods by F.H. Balch. We have quite a long chapter ahead of us. This is, I believe, our longest chapter to date. At, I believe, 17 pages, so quite a lot. This is also the first video that I've made in a while. I've started batching videos recently. And so, because I've been on a bit of a vacation, a bit of a time where I've had this time at home. So, after having exhausted that, now I sort of have to make videos. Chapter 2. On the way to the council. They arrived at the village of Wishram from Irving's Astoria. The camp was all astir at dawn, for sunset must see them far on the way. They must first cross the prairies to the northward till they struck the Columbia, then take the great trail leading down it to the Willamette Valley. It was a 2 days' journey at the least. Squaws were preparing a hurried meal. Lodge poles were being taken down, and the mats that covered them rolled up and strapped on the backs of horses. Indians, yelling and vociferating, were driving up bands of horses from which pack and riding ponies were to be selected. Unbroken animals were rearing and plunging beneath their first burdens, while mongrel curs ran barking at their heels. Here and there, unskillful hands were throwing the lasso amid the jeers and laughter of the spectators. All was tumult and excitement. At length they were underway. First rode the squaws, driving before them pack horses and ponies, for the herds and entire movable property of the tribe accompanied it in all its marches. The squaws rode astride, like men, in the rude wooden saddles that one yet sees used by the wilder Indians of eastern Oregon and Idaho. Very high, both before and behind, looking like exaggerated pack saddles. A hair rope tied around the lower jaw of the horse answered for a bridle. To this must be added the quirt, a short double-lashed whip fastened into a hollow and curiously carved handle. The application of this whip was so constant as to keep the right arm in continual motion, so that even today on the frontier, an Indian rider can be distinguished from a white man at a distance by the constant rising and falling of the whip arm. With the squaws were the children, some of whom, not even 4, 5, and 6 years of age, rode alone on horseback, tied in the high saddles, managing their steeds with instinctive skill, and when the journey became fatiguing, going to sleep, secured by their fastenings from falling off. Next came the men, on the best horses, unencumbered by weight of any kind, and armed with bow and arrow. Here and there, a lance pointed with flint, a stone knife or hatchet, or heavy war club hung at the saddle. But the bow and arrow constituted their chief weapon. The men formed a kind of rear guard, protecting the migrating tribe from any sudden assault on the part of the Bannocks. There were perhaps 200 fighting men in all. Snoqualmie was at their head, and beside him rode the young Willamette runner who had brought the summons from Multnomah the day before. The Willamette was on horseback for the first time in his life. The inland or prairie tribes of eastern Oregon, coming as they did in contact with tribes whose neighbors bordered on Mexico, had owned horses for perhaps a generation. But the seaboard tribes owned a very few, and there were tribes on Puget Sound and at the mouth of the Columbia who had never seen them. Even the Willamettes, sovereign tribe of the Confederacy though they were, had but few horses. This morning, the young Willamette had bought a colt, giving for it a whole string of Yagua shells. It was a pretty delicate thing, and he was proud of it, and had shown his pride by slitting its ears and cutting off its tail, as was the barbarous custom with many of the Indians. He sat on the little creature now, and loaded it as it was with a double weight of himself and the heavy wooden saddle. It could hardly keep pace with the older and stronger horses. In the rear of all rode Cecil Grey and the Shoshone renegade, who had helped him bury the dead Bannock the evening before. Cecil's form was as slight and graceful in its Indian garb as in days gone by, and his face was still the handsome, sensitive face it had been 8 years before. It was stronger now, more resolute and mature, and from long intercourse with the Indians, there had come into it something grave and Indian-like, but it only gave more of dignity to his mien. His brown beard swept his breast, and his face was bronzed, but the lips quivered under the beard, and the cheek flushed and paled under the bronze. What had he been doing in the 8 years that had elapsed since he left his New England home? Let us listen to his story in his own words as he tells it to the Shoshone renegade by his side. I lived in a land far to the east, beside a great water. My people were white like myself. I was one of an order of men whom the Great Spirit had appointed to preach of goodness, mercy, and truth, and to explain to the people the sayings of a mighty book which he had given to the fathers, a book that told how men should live in this world, and that a beautiful place in the next world be given those who are good and true in this. But by and by, the Great Spirit began to whisper to me of the Indians in the wilderness who knew nothing of the book or the hope within it. But there were ties that held me to my own people, and I knew not what to do. Death cut those ties, and in my hour of grief there came to me a vision of a great bridge far in the west, and of Indians passing over it, and a voice spoke to me and bade me go and seek the land of the bridge, for the Great Spirit had a mission for me there. And I went forth into the wilderness. I met many tribes and tarried with them, telling them of God. Many were evil and treated me harshly. Others were kind and listened. Some loved me and wished me to abide always in their lodges and be one of them. But even while they spoke, the Great Spirit whispered to me to go on, and an unrest rose within me, and I could not stay. So the years went by, and I wandered farther and farther to the west, across rivers and deserts, till I reached this tribe. And they said that farther on toward the land of the Willamettes, a great river flowed through the mountains, and across it was a bridge of stone, built by the gods when the world was young. Then I knew that it was the bridge of my vision, and the unrest came back, and I arose to go. But the tribe kept me, half as guest and half as prisoner, and would not let me depart. Until last night, the renner came summoning them to the council. Now they go, taking me with them. I shall see the land of the bridge and perform the work the Great Spirit has given me to do. The old grand enthusiasm shone in his look as he closed. The Shoshone regarded him with grave attention. What became of the book that told of God? He asked earnestly. A chief took it from me and burned it, but its words were written on my heart, and they could not be destroyed. They rode on for a time in silence. The way was rugged, the country a succession of canyons and ridges, covered with green and waving grass, but bare of trees. Behind them, the blue mountains were receding in the distance. To the west, Mount Hood, the great white witch mountain of the Indians, towered over the prairie, streaking the sky with a long floating wreath of volcanic smoke. Before them, as they journeyed northward toward the Columbia, stretched out the endless prairie. Now they descended into a deep ravine. Now they toiled up a steep hillside. The country literally rolled, undulating in immense ridges around and over which the long file of squaws and warriors, herds and pack horses wound like a serpent. From the bands ahead came shouts and outcries, the sounds of rude merriment, and above all, the long-drawn intonation so familiar to those who have been much with Indian horsemen. The endlessly repeated ho-ha, 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 a kind of crude riding song. After a while, Cecil said, I have told you the story of my life. Will you not tell me the story of yours? Yes, said the renegade after a moment's thought. You have shown me your heart as if you were my brother. Now I will show you mine. I was a Shoshone warrior. Note, see Bonneville's Adventures, chapters 13 and 48. There was a girl in our village whom I had loved from childhood. We played together. We talked of how, when I became a man and a warrior, she would become my wife. She would keep my wigwam. We would always love one another. She grew up, and the chief offered many horses for her. Her father took them. She became the chief's wife, and all my heart withered up. Everything grew dark. I sat in my wigwam, or wandered in the forest, caring for nothing. When I met her, she turned her face aside, for was she not the wife of another? Yet I know her heart hungered for me. The chief knew it too, and when he spoke to her, a cloud was ever on his brow, and sharp lightning on his tongue. But she was true, whose lodge was as clean as his. The wood was always carried, the water at hand, the meat cooked. She searched the very thought that was in his heart to save him the trouble of speaking. He could never say, why is it not done? But her heart was mine, and he knew it, and he treated her like a dog and not like a wife. Me too he tried to tread underfoot. One day we assembled to hunt the buffalo. Our horses were all collected. Mine stood before my tent, and he came and took them away, saying that they were his. What could I do? He was a chief. I came no more to the council. I shared no more in the hunt and the war dance. I was unhorsed, degraded, dishonored. He told his wife what he had done, and when she wept, he beat her. One evening I stood on a knoll overlooking the meadow where the horses were feeding. The chief's horses were there and mine with them. I saw him walking among them. The sight maddened me. My blood burned. I leaped on him. With 2 blows I laid him dead at my feet. I covered him with earth and strewed leaves over the place. Then I went to her, and I told her what I had done, and urged her to fly with me. She answered only with tears. I reminded her of all she had suffered, and told her I had done only what was just. I urged her again to fly. She only wept the more and bade me go. My heart was heavy, but my eyes were dry. It is well, I said. I will go alone to the desert. None but the wild beasts of the wilderness will be with me. The seekers of blood will follow on my trail. They may come to me while I am asleep and stay with me, but you will be safe. I will go alone. I turned to go. She sprang after me. No, she cried. You shall not go alone. Wherever you go, I will go. You shall never part from me. While we were talking, one who had seen me slay the chief and had roused the camp came with others. We heard their steps approaching the door and knew that death came with them. We escaped at the back of the lodge, but they saw us, and their arrows flew. She fell, and I caught her in my arms and fled into the wood. When we were safe, and I looked at her, I carried, and she was dead. An arrow had pierced her heart. I buried her that night beneath a heap of stones and fled to the Cayuses. That is my story. What will you do now? Asked Cecil, deeply touched. I shall live a man's life. I shall hunt and go on the war trail and say strong words in the council. And when my life is ended, when the sunset and the night come to me, and I go forth into the darkness, I know I shall find her I love, waiting for me beside the death trail that leads to the spirit land. The tears came into Cecil's eyes. I too have known sorrow, he said, and like you, I am a wanderer from my own people. We are going together into an unknown land, knowing not what may befall us. Let us be friends. And he held out his hand. The Indian took it, awkwardly, as an Indian always takes the hand of a white man, but warmly, heartily. We are brothers, he said simply. And as Cecil rode on with the wild troop into the unknown world before him, he felt that there was one beside him who would be faithful, no matter what befell. The long day wore on. The sun rose to the zenith and sunk, and still the Indians pushed forward. It was a long, forced march, and Cecil was terribly fatigued when at last one of the Indians told him that they were near a big river where they would camp for the night. One sun more, said the Indian, pointing to the sun now sinking in the west, and you will see the bridge of the gods. The news reanimated Cecil, and he hurried on. A shout rose from the Indians in advance. He saw the head of the long train of horses, and riders pause and look downward, and the Indians at the rear gallop forward. Cecil and his friend followed and joined them. "The river! The river!" cried the Indians as they rode up. The scene below was one of gloomy but magnificent beauty. Beneath them opened an immense canyon, stupendous even in that land of canyons, the great canyon of the Columbia. The walls were brown, destitute of verdure, sinking downward from their feet in yawning precipices or steep slopes. At the bottom, more than 1,000 feet below, wound a wide blue river, the gathered waters of half a continent. Beneath them, the river plunged over a long, low precipice with a roar that filled the canyon for miles. Farther on, the flat banks encroached upon the stream until it seemed narrowed to a silver thread among the jutting rocks. Still farther, it widened again, swept grandly around a bend in the distance, and passed from sight. "Tomb, tomb," said the Indians to Cecil, in tones that imitated the roar of the cataract. It was the tum of Lewis and Clark, the tum water of more recent times. And the place below, where the compressed river wound like a silver thread among the flat black rocks, was the far-framed Dalles of the Columbia. It was superb, and yet there was something profoundly lonely and desolate about it. The majestic river flowing on forever among barren rocks and crags, shut in by mountain and desert, wrapped in an awful solitude, where from age to age scarce a sound was heard, save the cry of wild beasts or wilder men. It is the very river of death and of desolation, thought Cecil. It looked lonely, forsaken, as if no eye had beheld it from the day of creation until now. Looking again at the falls, he saw what he had not noticed before: a large camp of Indians on the side nearest them. Glancing across the river, he descried on a knoll on the opposite bank. What? Houses? He could not believe his eyes. Could it be possible? Yes, they certainly were long, low houses, roofed as the white man roofs his. A sudden wild hope thrilled him. His brain grew dizzy. He turned to one of the Indians. "Who built those houses?" he exclaimed. "White men like me?" The other shook his head. "No, Indians." Cecil's heart died within him. After all, he murmured, it was absurd to expect to find a settlement of white men here. How could I think that any but Indians had built those houses? Still, as they descended the steep, zigzag pathway leading down the river, he could not help gazing again and again at the buildings that so reminded him of home. It was Wishram, the ancient village of the falls, whose brave and insolent inhabitants, more than a century later, were the dread of the early explorers and fur traders of the Columbia. It was built at the last and highest fishery on the Columbia, for the salmon could not at that time ascend the river up the falls. All the wandering tribes of the upper Columbia came there to fish or to buy salmon of the Wishram farmers. There, too, the Indians of the lower Columbia and the Willamette met them and bartered the hiagwa shells, the dried berries, and wapato of the country for the bear claws and buffalo robes of the interior. It was a rendezvous where buying, selling, gambling, dancing, feasting took the place of war and the chase. Though the ever-burning enmities of the tribes sometimes inflamed into deadly feuds, and the fair ground not infrequently became a field of battle. The houses of Wishram were built of logs, the walls low, the lower half being below the surface of the ground, so that they were virtually half cellar. At a distance, the log walls and arched roofs gave them very much the appearance of a frontier town of the whites. As they descended to the riverside, Cecil looked again and again at the village, so different from the skin or bark lodges of the Rocky Mountain tribes he had been with for so long. But the broad and sweeping river flowed between, and his gaze told him little more than his first glance had done. They were now approaching the camp. Some of the younger braves, at the head of the Cayuse train, dashed toward it, yelling and whooping in the wildest manner. Through the encampment rang an answering shout. The Cayuses, and the white medicine man. The news spread like wildfire, and men came running from all directions to greet the latest arrivals. It was a scene of abject squalor that met Cecil's eyes as he rode with the others into the camp. Never had he seen among the Indian races aught so degraded as those Columbia River tribes. The air was putrid with decaying fish. The very skins and mats that covered the lodge poles were black with rancid salmon and filth. Many of the men were nude. Most of the women wore only a short garment of skin or woven cedar bark around the waist, falling scarcely to the knees. The heads of many had been artificially flattened. Their faces were brutal, their teeth worn to the gums with eating sanded salmon. And here and there, bleared and unsightly eyes showed the terrible prevalence of ophthalmia. Salmon were drying in the sun on platforms raised above the reach of dogs. Half-starved horses, whose raw and bleeding mouths showed the effect of the hair rope bridles, and whose projecting ribs showed their principal nutriment to be sagebrush and whiplash, were picketed among the lodges. Coyote-like dogs and unclad children, shrill and impish, ran riot, fighting together for half-dried, half-decayed pieces of salmon. Prevailing over everything was the stench, which is unique and unparalleled among the stench of the earth, the stench of an Indian camp at a Columbia fishery. Note: see Townsend's narrative, pages 137 and 138. Both Lewis and Clark and Ross Cox substantiate his description. Indeed, very much the same thing can be seen at the Tumwater fishery today. Perhaps 10 of the petty island tribes had assembled there as to their starting point for the great council at Wapato Island. All had heard rumors of the white man who had appeared among the tribes to the south, saying that the Great Spirit had sent him to warn the Indians to become better, and all were anxious to see him. They pointed him out to one another as he rode up, the man of graceful presence and delicate build. They thronged around him, naked men and half-clad women, squalid, fierce as wild beasts, and gazed wonderingly. "It is he, the white man," they whispered among themselves. "See the long beard, see the white hands. Stand back, the Great Spirit sent him. He is strong, Tomanoas. Beware his anger." Now the horses were unpacked and the lodges pitched under the eyes of the larger part of the encampment, who watched everything with insatiable curiosity and stole all that they could lay their hands on. Especially did they hang on every motion of Cecil. and he sank very much in their estimation when they found that he helped his servant, the old Indian woman, put up his lodge. "Oh, he does squaw's work," was the Aunt Gracious comment. After a while, when the lodge was up and Cecil lay weary and exhausted upon his mat within it, a messenger entered and told him that the Indians were all collected near the river bank and wished him to come and give him the talk he had brought from the Great Spirit. Worn as he was, Cecil rose and went. It was in the interval between sunset and dark. The sun still shone on the cliffs above the great canyon, but in the spaces below the shadows were deepening. On the flat rocks near the bank of the river, and close to the falls of Tumwater, the Indians were gathered to the number of several hundred, awaiting him, some squatting, Indian fashion, on the ground, others standing upright, looking taller than human in the dusky light. Mingled with the debased tribes that made up the larger part of the gathering, Cecil saw here and there warriors of a bolder and superior race, Yakimas and Klickitats, clad in skins or wrapped in blankets woven of the wool of mountain sheep. Cecil stood before them and spoke, using the Willamette tongue, the language of common intercourse among the tribes, all of whom had different dialects. The audience listened in silence while he told them of the goodness and compassion of the Great Spirit, how it grieved him to see his children at war among themselves, and how he, Cecil, had been sent to warn them to forsake their sins and live better lives. Long familiarity with the Indians had imparted to him somewhat of their manner of thinking and speaking. His language had become picturesque with Indian imagery, and his style of oratory had acquired a tinge of Indian gravity. But the intense and vivid spirituality that had ever been the charm of his eloquence was in it still. There was something in his words that, for the moment, and unconsciously to them, lifted his hearers to a higher plane. When he closed, there was upon them that vague remorse, that dim desire to be better, that indefinable wistfulness, which his earnest, tender words never failed to arouse in his hearers. When he lifted his hands at the close of his talk and prayed that the Great Spirit might pity them, that he might take away from them the black and wicked heart of war and hate, and give them back the new heart of peace and love, the silence was almost breathless, broken only by the unceasing roar of the falls and the solemn pleading of the missionary's voice. He led them and returned through the deepening shadows to his lodge. There he flung himself on the couch of furs the old Indian woman had spread for him. Fatigued with the long ride of the day and the heavy draft his address had made on an overtaxed frame, he tried to sleep. But he could not. The buildings of the town of Wishram across the river, so like the buildings of the white man, had awakened 1,000 memories of home. Vivid pictures of his life in New England and in the cloisters of Magdalen came before his sleepless eyes. The longing for the refined and pleasant things that had filled his life rose strong and irrepressible within him. Such thoughts were never entirely absent from his mind, but at times they seemed to dominate him completely, driving him into a perfect fever of unrest and discontent. After tossing for hours on his couch, he arose and went out into the open air. The stars were bright, the moon flooded the wide cane with luster, The towering walls rose dim and shadowy on either side of the river, whose waters gleamed white in the moonlight. The solemn roar of the falls filled the silence of the night. Around him was the barbarian encampment, with here and there a fire burning and a group of warriors talking beside it. He walked forth among the lodges. Some were silent, save for the heavy breathing of the sleepers. Others were lighted up within, and he could hear the murmur of voices. At one place, he found around a large fire a crowd who were feasting, late as was the hour, and boasting of their exploits. He stood in the shadow a moment and listened. One of them concluded his tale by springing to his feet, advancing a few paces from the circle of firelight, and making a fierce speech to invisible foes. Leading toward the land of the Shoshones, he denounced them with the utmost fury, dared them to face him, scorned them because they did not appear, and ended by shaking his tomahawk in their direction, amid the applause of his comrades. Cecil passed on and reached the outer limit of the camp. There, amid some large boulders, he almost stumbled on a band of Indians engaged in some grisly ceremony. He saw them, however, in time to escape observation and screen himself behind one of the rocks. One of the Indians held a rattlesnake pinned to the ground with a forked stick. Another held out a piece of liver to the snake and was provoking him to bite it. Again and again the snake, quivering with fury and rattling savagely, plunged his fangs into the liver. Several Indians stood looking on with arrows in their hands. At length, when the meat was thoroughly impregnated with the virus, the snake was released and allowed to crawl away. Then they all dipped the points of their arrows in the poisoned liver, carefully marking the shaft of each in order to distinguish it from those not poisoned. Note: see Bancroft's Native Races, article Columbians. A bunch of arrows so poisoned is in the Museum of the Oregon State University at Eugene. None of them saw Cecil, and he left without being discovered. Why did they wish to go to council with poisoned arrows? Further on, among the rocks and remote from the camp, he saw a great light and heard a loud hallooing. He went cautiously toward it. He found a large fire in an open space, and perhaps 30 savages, stripped and painted, dancing around it, brandishing their weapons, and chanting a kind of war chant. On every face, as the light fell on it, was mad ferocity and lust of war. Near them lay the freshly killed body of a horse whose blood they had been drinking. Drunk with frenzy, drunk with blood, they danced and whirled in that wild saturnalia till Cecil grew dizzy with their sight. Note: Irving's Astoria, chapter 41. He made his way back to the camp and sought his lodge. He heard the wolves howling on the hills, and a dark presentiment of evil crept over him. It is not to council that these men are going, but to war, he murmured, as he threw himself on his couch. God help me to be faithful, whatever comes. God help me to keep my life and my words filled with his spirit, so that these savage men may be drawn to him and made better, and my mission be fulfilled. I can never hope to see the face of white man again, but I can live and die faithful to the last. So thinking, a sweet and restful peace came to him, and he fell asleep. and even while he thought how impossible it was for him ever to reach the land of the white man again, an English exploring ship lay at anchor at Equina Bay, only 2 days' ride distant, and on it were some who had known and loved him in times gone by, but who had long since thought him lost in the wilderness forever. And so ends this quite long chapter. One thing to note, which I skipped over, is we have another drawing inserted into the narrative here, noting the great, quote, witch mountain of the Indians. Showing Mount Hood smoking as a volcano. And it's true that Mount Hood is a volcano, but it has been dormant for many centuries that I have known, many years certainly. This makes me think if in more recent centuries past, in the 1600s, it was an active volcano, or at least a smoking, dormant volcano. Interesting. So ends our reading for tonight. Thank you all for watching and continuing to watch. And have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.